You arrive at solitude not as a choice, but as a consequence, and this is the first illusion I must dissolve for you. Most people believe solitude is something the loner chooses because they cannot belong, cannot adapt, cannot endure intimacy. This belief belongs to the crowd, not to psychology. In the psychic economy of the empath, solitude is not avoidance, it is an upgrade. It is the moment the psyche stops leaking energy through unconscious contracts and begins to consolidate itself into a structure that can no longer be invaded without consent. You see, the empath does not begin life armored, quite the opposite. You begin porous, your nervous system is open, attuned, receptive beyond what the world is prepared to meet responsibly. You feel before you understand, you absorb before you discriminate, and because the psyche abhors a vacuum, what enters you shapes you long before you are aware it has done so. This is why empaths often mistake early emotional saturation for love, and intrusion for intimacy. The soul learns its first language through exposure, not choice. When I speak of the loner upgrade, I am not referring to isolation born of bitterness or superiority. I am speaking of a psychic mutation that occurs when the empath's unconscious finally recognizes a pattern it can no longer survive within. At that moment, withdrawal ceases to be a reaction and becomes an instinct of preservation. The psyche does not announce this shift politely. It signals it through exhaustion, through a sudden intolerance for noise, through a bodily refusal to remain accessible to everyone. In analysis, I observed again and again that those with heightened empathy reach a point where their dreams begin to change texture. The crowded rooms disappear. The familiar faces fade. Instead, symbols of enclosure emerge: mountains, caves, empty houses, long roads with no companions. The unconscious is not punishing you, it is preparing you. Solitude is not exile, it is incubation. Understand this clearly. Armor is not hardness. Armor is containment. What destroys the empath is not feeling too much, but feeling without boundaries. The psyche cannot individuate if it is perpetually entangled, and individuation, as I have said before, is not becoming better, it is becoming whole. Wholeness requires edges. Solitude is where those edges are forged. You may believe you are becoming colder. Others will certainly tell you that you have changed, that you are distant, that you are no longer the same. They are correct, but not in the way they think. You are no longer available, and availability, when unconscious, is not virtue. It is vulnerability without sovereignty. The empath's greatest wound is not cruelty from others, but the inability to distinguish what belongs to them and what does not. Early on, you learned to merge because merging kept you safe. You learned to read the room because misreading it was dangerous. You learned to carry emotions that were not yours because someone else could not carry them themselves. This is not weakness, it is adaptation. But adaptation, when prolonged beyond its usefulness, becomes pathology. Solitude interrupts this pathology. In solitude, projection collapses. There is no one left to save, no one left to stabilize, no one left to mirror back an identity that was never truly yours. This is why solitude feels terrifying at first. The empath does not fear being alone. They fear meeting themselves without intermediaries. They fear the silence in which no one needs them. Yet it is precisely here that the armor begins to grow, not as a shell, but as an internal structure. Think of the tortoise. Its shell is not something it wears. It is part of its skeleton. Likewise, the empath's armor is not emotional numbness. It is the reorganization of the psyche around an inner center of gravity. In the presence of others, the empath's center tends to drift. Attention pulls it outward, needs rearrange it, expectations bend it. In solitude, the center sinks inward, slowly, quietly, irreversibly. This is why, once the loner upgrade completes, the empath cannot return to their former state without psychic injury. The nervous system remembers coherence. You will notice something subtle happening during this phase. Your tolerance for manipulation vanishes, not because you have learned new tactics, but because your unconscious no longer responds to old signals. Guilt no longer hooks you. Emotional urgency no longer mobilizes you. Drama sounds foreign, like a language you once spoke fluently but have now forgotten. This is not detachment as defense. This is detachment as maturity. I must caution you here. Many confuse solitude with superiority. That is the ego's counterfeit version of this transformation. True solitude humbles you. It strips away the roles that once gave you identity. It confronts you with the parts of yourself that were hidden behind usefulness. The shadow emerges here, not the shadow you feared, but the one you neglected. In isolation, the empath meets their repressed aggression, their unexpressed anger, their long denied refusal. These do not appear as violence, but as clarity, as a firm no, as a boundary that does not explain itself. The psyche integrates what it once disowned, and when this happens, others feel it immediately, though they cannot name it. They will say you feel different, heavier, quieter, unreachable. What they are sensing is density. Before, your energy was diffuse. Now it is concentrated. Before, you were readable. Now you are opaque, not because you are hiding, but because there is nothing leaking out that does not wish to be seen. This is why solitude becomes armor, not because it keeps others out, but because it keeps you in. The empath who has upgraded no longer bleeds identity into every interaction. They choose, and choice is the true beginning of freedom. At this stage, dreams often present a solitary figure standing in a vast landscape. There is no threat, no pursuit, only presence. The unconscious is depicting the self, no longer fragmented by the demands of others. The individuation process accelerates here, not through effort, but through subtraction. What is unnecessary falls away. You may grieve during this time, not people, but versions of yourself, the one who tried harder, the one who explained endlessly, the one who believed love meant endurance. These figures dissolve quietly. There is no ceremony, only relief. And yet, something else begins to happen, something that unsettles those who once had access to you. Your silence acquires weight. Your absence reorganizes dynamics you are no longer participating in, not because you intend to control, but because systems depend on predictable energy flows. When you withdraw, the system trembles. This is why solitude frightens others when it is chosen unconsciously by the empath. They sense that you are no longer orbiting them. Gravity has shifted, and gravity, once internalized, does not announce itself. What comes next is not reintegration, not yet. There is a deeper descent still unfolding, one where solitude no longer feels like withdrawal, but like home, and where the armor you have grown begins to reshape how the world approaches you at every level of contact. Solitude, once it stops feeling like absence, begins to feel like a field. And this is where many misunderstand what is happening to you. They assume you are retreating from life, when in truth you are entering it for the first time without intermediaries. The psyche, no longer overstimulated by the emotional weather of others, starts to generate its own climate. This is not emptiness, it is depth, and depth, to those who live on the surface of constant interaction, appears like coldness. In this field of solitude, the empath encounters a strange reversal. What once felt unbearable silence, stillness, lack of demand now feels stabilizing. The nervous system recalibrates, hypervigilance fades, the perpetual scanning of faces, toners, moods, expectations loses its urgency. You are no longer listening for danger in every pause. This is not because danger has disappeared, but because you no longer need to anticipate it to survive. Here, something subtle but profound takes place. The empath's identity, once woven from responsiveness, begins to unravel. You realize how much of who you thought you were existed only in reaction. You were kind because someone needed kindness. You were patient because someone was chaotic. You were understanding because someone refused to understand themselves. In solitude, these reflexes have nowhere to land, and so they turn inward. At first, this inward turn can feel like disorientation. If no one is pulling on you, who are you? If no one needs you, what gives you value? These questions do not arise from narcissism, but from conditioning. You were trained implicitly, often silently, to equate worth with usefulness. Solitude dismantles this equation mercilessly. It does not argue. It simply removes the stage. This is why solitude is an initiation. Ancient mystery traditions understood this. The desert, the cave, the forest, these were not places of punishment, but of encounter, not encounter with gods in the theatrical sense, but with the self as a living reality rather than a concept. When the empath enters solitude, they are not escaping the world. They are undergoing a rite the world no longer provides. In this rite, the shadow becomes unavoidable. Not the shadow projected onto others, but the shadow of self-abandonment. You begin to see how often you betrayed your own signals to preserve connection, how often you silenced your instincts to remain acceptable, how often you translated your pain into patience so that others would not have to feel discomfort. This recognition is not gentle, but it is clean. And here is the paradox. As you withdraw, your capacity for real connection increases, not immediately and not socially, but psychologically, because connection without self-containment is fusion, not relationship. The empath who has upgraded through solitude no longer dissolves upon contact. They remain themselves while meeting another. This is rare, and rarity unsettles those who unconsciously depend on diffusion. You may notice that people begin to approach you differently, some with curiosity, some with anxiety, some with resentment they cannot articulate. Your silence does not invite extraction. Your presence does not offer emotional labor by default. And because so many relationships are organized around unconscious exchange, attention for validation, care for control, empathy for permission, your refusal to participate disrupts the economy. This disruption is often misinterpreted as arrogance, but arrogance is inflation. What you are experiencing is deflation of the false self. You are no longer compensating for others' internal chaos, and without that compensation, the illusion of harmony collapses. They feel exposed. You feel centered. It is important to understand that this phase is not antisocial. It is pre-social. In a truer sense, you are learning to exist without needing to be mirrored. The psyche is discovering that it can generate meaning internally rather than borrowing it from reaction. This is why solitude becomes armor. It protects the inner image from constant distortion. Dreams during this phase often involve thresholds, doors that open into empty rooms, bridges crossed alone, bodies of water navigated without assistance. These are not symbols of loss, but of autonomy. The unconscious is rehearsing self-trust. It is teaching you that you can move through psychic space without being accompanied. And yet, there is a danger here, one that must be named without moralism. Solitude can harden into isolation if it becomes an identity rather than a phase. The armor must remain flexible. True armor adapts. It does not petrify. If you cling to solitude as proof of superiority or as protection against all intimacy, the psyche stagnates. The goal is not permanent withdrawal, but conscious engagement. However, this engagement can only occur after the center has stabilized. Before that, connection is premature. This is why attempts to pull you back before you are ready feel invasive. Your psyche knows it is still under construction, and it will resist interruption with a ferocity that surprises even you. You may find that explanations exhaust you now, that justifying your boundaries feels unnecessary. This is not cruelty, it is coherence. The integrated psyche does not require constant translation. Those who are attuned will feel you without instruction. Those who are not will demand access in increasingly aggressive ways. Their urgency is not about you, it is about the loss of influence. Solitude reveals this distinction with brutal clarity. You begin to see who valued you for presence and who valued you for provision, who respected your being and who depended on your availability. This seeing cannot be unseen, and once seen, the psyche refuses to return to blindness. There is a moment, often quiet, often unmarked, when you realize you are no longer lonely. You are alone, yes, but loneliness requires an expectation of rescue. Solitude does not. Solitude is self-sufficient. It does not wait, it does not ache, it rests. In this rest, something ancient awakens. A sense of inner authority that does not assert itself loudly. It simply exists. Decisions become slower, but firmer. Desires become fewer, but deeper. You are no longer pulled toward intensity for its own sake. You seek resonance, and resonance cannot be forced. This is why the world begins to approach you differently. Some drift away naturally, Others attempt to provoke reaction to confirm they still exist in your psyche, but reaction no longer comes easily. Not because you are numb, but because you are no longer hollow. The armor of solitude is now functional. It filters. It does not block. It allows what aligns and deflects what drains. And because it was grown organically through withdrawal, through silence, through confrontation with the shadow, it does not feel like a defense. It feels like skin. What remains now is a final transformation, one that occurs not in isolation, but in selective return, a phase where solitude no longer defines you, but supports you, where the empath steps back into relation without losing center, and where the presence you carry begins to alter not just dynamics, but the very atmosphere of interaction itself. When the empath returns from solitude, something irreversible has already taken place. This return is not a re-entry into old roles, nor a reconciliation with former dynamics. It is a different organism walking back into the same terrain. And this is why the world feels strangely misaligned when you step into it again. The rooms are familiar, the faces unchanged, the patterns still repeating themselves, but you are no longer calibrated to respond as before. The psyche has reorganized around a center that no longer negotiates its existence. This is the moment when many empaths experience a quiet shock. They realize that connection does not feel the way it used to. The charge is gone, the pull is absent. What once felt magnetic now feels neutral, and neutrality, to a psyche accustomed to intensity as proof of meaning, can feel like loss, but this is not loss, it is clarity. Intensity was never intimacy. It was resonance between unintegrated parts. It was the meeting of wounds that recognized each other without healing each other. Solitude burned through that illusion. What remains now is something less dramatic and far more powerful, presence without hunger. You will notice that conversations shorten, not because you are withholding, but because excess words fall away naturally. You no longer explain yourself into existence. You no longer soften truths to preserve attachment. The psyche has learned that survival does not depend on being understood. This realization is not cynical, it is liberating. Others may sense this shift before you do. They will feel that something no longer lands. Their usual strategies, emotional appeal, urgency, guilt, charms slide off without friction, not because you are resisting them, but because there is nothing inside you that resonates with manipulation anymore. Manipulation requires an internal hook. Solitude removed it. This is where the armor reveals its true function. It does not repel people aggressively. It simply makes inappropriate access impossible. Like a locked door that does not announce itself as locked. It forces others to confront their own assumptions about entitlement. Those who were accustomed to walking into your inner world uninvited now find no entrance. Some will attempt to provoke reaction. They will accuse you of being cold, too distant, changed. They are correct, but the accusation carries desperation. Reaction was how they confirmed relevance. Without it, they feel erased. But erasure is not your doing. It is the consequence of no longer being central to your psychic life. This phase often brings a strange calm, accompanied by an even stranger sadness. Not grief for others, but grief for the version of yourself who once believed endless accessibility was love. You may feel compassion for that self without any desire to return to it. This is integration. The psyche does not reject its past adaptations. It thanks them and retires them. Here, the empath begins to experience something rare. Emotional sovereignty. Feelings still arise, but they no longer flood. Empathy remains, but it is no longer compulsory. You can perceive another's pain without absorbing it. This distinction marks the transition from porous empathy to embodied compassion. Embodied compassion does not rush. It does not rescue. It does not dissolve boundaries in the name of kindness. It recognizes suffering without needing to enter it. This is why the empath who has completed the loner upgrade often appears unreachable, not because they are disconnected, but because they are no longer available for unconscious fusion. Dreams at this stage often shift again. You may find yourself walking among others without interacting, observing without intervening, standing at the edge of scenes that once would have demanded your participation. The unconscious is showing you that you can remain present without being responsible. This is profoundly unsettling for those around you. Systems reorganize around predictable roles. When you stop playing yours, the system reacts. Some people will try to pull you back with nostalgia, others with accusation, others with crisis, but none of these will work the way they once did, because the internal agreement has dissolved. And here is the crucial insight. You did not break the agreement consciously. It expired. The psyche outgrew it. Growth does not ask permission. At this stage, solitude no longer feels like withdrawal. It becomes a reference point. You can enter relationships, environments, conversations, and still feel alone in the right way. Alone not as abandoned, but as anchored. Your inner world no longer collapses outward under pressure. This is why your presence begins to change rooms without effort. You do not dominate, you do not perform, you simply occupy space differently. The absence of need creates a subtle authority that cannot be imitated. People sense it instinctively. Some feel drawn to it, others feel threatened by it. Both reactions reveal more about them than about you. You may notice that fewer people remain close, but those who do are different. They do not rush, they do not demand, they do not require explanation. They meet you where you are without trying to extract something from you. These connections are quieter, slower, and far more real. This is not loneliness returning, this is selectivity emerging. The empath who has passed through solitude carries an inner silence that cannot be disturbed by noise. They can engage without being consumed. They can care without collapsing. They can withdraw without guilt. This is not indifference, it is discernment, and discernment is the final gift of the loner upgrade. Yet there remains one last threshold, often overlooked, a subtle temptation to remain hidden, to mistake invisibility for safety, to keep the armor closed even when openness would no longer cost you yourself. This is the final shadow of solitude, the fear that presence might undo what withdrawal created. What must be integrated next is not solitude itself, but the freedom to move between solitude and relation without losing center. A rhythm rather than a refuge, a sovereignty that does not depend on distance, because the ultimate armor is not separation. It is the unshakable knowledge that you can stand in the world, be seen, be felt, be touched by life, and remain entirely your own. There comes a point when even armor must become invisible to the one who wears it. If you still feel its weight, if you still notice yourself withdrawing in anticipation, then the transformation is not complete. The final stage does not announce itself as strength, it announces itself as ease. You stop monitoring yourself, you stop checking whether you are protected, you stop asking whether this interaction will cost you something, not because the world has become safe, but because your center no longer depends on conditions outside itself.